Thank you all for coming today, this Friday afternoon. We really have a treat ready for us today. My name's Lisa Featherstone. I'm Head of History here at University of Queensland. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners across Australia on whose spaces we all live and work. I'm fortunate here in Brisbane to be on the land of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, and it's gorgeous country that is really rich and beautiful and which has provided sustenance for traditional owners for many tens of thousands of years. And this is land that has not been ceded. I acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal elders, past, present, and those emerging now and in the future, and the traditional owners of the lands where you all are today. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Lynette Russell, who will be presenting today. I think Lynette probably needs very little introduction to many of us. Currently an ARC Laureate Professor in the Monash Indigenous Studies Centre, Lynette has worked very widely across time and place. She has published extensively on Indigenous people in the maritime world, on contact histories, studies of the Mara and Wurundjeri people of Victoria, as well as work on nationalism, human rights, and of course in anthropology, just to mention a few. Today, I'm delighted that Lynette is going to speak on memories and narratives and ongoing reflection. We're going to take questions at the end of Lynette's presentation, so feel free to submit your questions at any time via the question and answer portal, and we'll get to them at the end. So I'll pass over now to Lynette. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you for the invitation to talk to University of Queensland history. I'm also very grateful for that lovely acknowledgement that Lisa just gave. I always begin by acknowledging that we meet, and indeed I write and live and work on the unceded lands of the Kulin Nations, the Wurundjeri and Wurrung people of Naarm, what is now known as the City of Melbourne. To be honest, generally speaking, I find acknowledgements to be rather unsatisfactory and cursory, very easily passed over. So I'm going to ask you just to take a couple of minutes to think about this. So instead, I'm going to ask you to imagine that here, as I sit in my home in inner Melbourne, beneath the kilometres of coaxial and inadequate NBN cable, the tons of concrete, the mountains of steel, that every single footfall that we take is on Aboriginal land. And I say Aboriginal land because I haven't yet had the privilege of working with Torres Strait Islanders. Where once there were dreaming tracks, we have tram tracks, bike lanes, walking paths and roads beneath the buildings, sits land on which Aboriginal people have for tens of thousands of years since time immemorial lived. Perhaps over 3,000 generations, mother to son, father to daughter, we lived, thrived and survived. Born here, died here, buried here, practiced ceremonies here, hunted, fished, gathered here, built our homes here. They told stories of the night skies, the seasons, the changes over time, the yearly events. They traded high quality quarried stone across great distances, wove baskets and eel traps, decorated magnificent possum skin cloaks with ochre designs which told the story of the owner's life. Cloaks that in time became burial shrouds. They saw drought and floods and practiced fire stick farming. They cared for and managed their landscape, ensuring that they benefited from its bounty. They watched the sea level rise and create Port Phillip Bay. They saw the Birrarung, now known as the Yarra, flood and retreat, and where it once wound its way across the plain is now the shipping channel. And through all of this, through those countless generations, thousands of stories, they maintained their connection to country, a connection that has never been broken, tested at times indeed, but never broken. And it is to all of those ancestors who went before me that I acknowledge, who I respect and who I am guided by, and whom I try to listen to. And this is what I want you to hear when I make my acknowledgement of country. Today I'm going to talk about a 20-year reflection on the book that I wrote, A Little Bird Told Me. What you have there on the screen is a photograph of my great-grandmother, photographed from her psychiatric file. So about 20 years ago, I published a book that documented a journey that I had been on for over a decade. The book, A Little Bird Told Me, Family Secrets and Necessary Lies, was a journey of discovery where I located my Aboriginal ancestors and answered a number of questions that had dogged my family for generations. Along the way, I discovered a story of secrets, lies and madness, and indeed refuge. In this talk, I'll reflect on the book nearly 20 years later with a focus on the importance of women as keepers of stories and the tellers of those stories too. In so doing, I'll consider the reasons why I wrote the book, what impact it had at the time, and its ongoing influence. I hope these reflections might have something to say to other historians, and I want to think finally about whether or not family history could be considered capital H history too. My recent re-engagement with A Little Bird Told Me has been timely, as the conservative and reactionary media and Twitter sphere at the time were attacking the Aboriginality of the Yuin elder and author Bruce Pascoe. Actions like that leave me seriously anxious, and I can still feel the sting of Andrew Bolt's attacks on me a few years ago when he took aim at me at a whiteness conference where I was giving a keynote. Clearly, I and my family were too fair for him, and he thought he could judge my heritage from a blurry black and white thumbnail. Watching the critics, including some Indigenous, pile onto Bruce Pascoe reminded me of the lateral violence I had seen and indeed felt. Well, maybe now, with a decade or two's distance, I could take a moment to think about that original work, its reception, its impact and its legacy. And all the time I would ask myself again, are there some secrets and necessary lies that should stay hidden? Quite recently, I've been had more than one quadrant article attacking me and Ian McNiven, and I figure that's keeping it in the family. But the most recent one was really just a right-wing nutter who's describing himself as a retired history professor who appears to have left no academic footprint to speak of, but has written round to every university in the country, slamming me and Ian McNiven and others for anyone who might speak up in this space and suggest that Bruce Pascoe had an interesting point to make. Originally, I began this exploration in response to Women's History Month, which was sort of ironic because although I'm a committed feminist, I've never really done what I considered to be feminist history. Yet, of course, the whole work that I've done on Emily is indeed feminist history. About 200 years ago in late January, I was in London. My lungs were still recovering from the bushfire smoke-induced asthma that had affected all of my Melbourne-based family. My London trip was very short. I was there to attend a funeral. I had no time to adjust to jet lag, and instead I took the opportunity to reread all of my original notes and diaries as I waited for the British Airways to decide if our flights were to be delayed. As they announced that all the flights to and from Wuhan in China, where I'd never heard before, had been cancelled until further notice, we got an inkling that COVID-19 might not just be a seasonal flu. We could never have imagined that 10 months later, over 41 million people will have contracted the disease and there'd be more than 1.1 million deaths. Remembering that only those deaths of those who've tested positive have been recorded as COVID deaths, and by most estimates, this pandemic has probably been responsible for many more fatalities. Those of us who study history are daily reminded of the 1919 influenza pandemic and the aftermath of both world wars. And of course, the ongoing impact of childhood polio, which shaped the destiny of many of my own family members. Now a distant memory, but I can recall adults who had grown up in the pre-vaccination era, contracted polio, leaving them with wizened legs and a shortened lifespan. Today, the social and historical lessons learned from these moments seem to be largely forgotten, and there's talk of nothing more than a medical model or an economic model. I'd like to think that we might also think about a social model. Throughout these conversations, I would suggest it's never been more pertinent a moment for the humanities, for the social sciences as well, for us scholars to be heard. We're almost invisible in this space, and we're certainly inaudible, but I'm going to argue that history, and in my case, Indigenous history, has never been more urgent. A Little Bird Told Me is the narrative I developed to try and understand the life of my great Aboriginal great-grandmother, Emily. Of course, by extension, it was intended to be an understanding of my grandmother, Gladys. I actually wrote the book for my father and for my children, but ultimately it was mostly for myself. I wanted to know why Emily and Gladys had taken great care to keep a number of secrets and maintain mistruths across the generations. One of the secrets in our family involved our Aboriginal heritage. We were everything from gypsies to Polynesian princess, the descendants of a Polynesian princess. Possibly another even more shameful secret in my grandmother's eyes was Emily's catastrophic mental breakdown and her subsequent lengthy confinement. Emily was detained in several mental hospitals under the Mental Hygiene Act of 1933. Between Christmas, she was first detained between Christmas 1925 and then 1941. She was for most part an inmate at Cooloola in Sunbury. After 16 years, she was declared relieved and her relationship with Gladys, her daughter, irreparably broken because she had left when Gladys was just a mere child and returned when she was now a young mother with a son. Before I had begun my research, I'd always somewhat romantically thought of Emily's madness as being something like Polonius in Hamilton, though this be madness, yet there be method in it. Or perhaps that of Emily Dickinson in Much Madness is in Divine Sense. She says, to a discerning eye, much sense, in the starkest madness, 'tis the majority. In this us all prevail, are sent, you are sane. Demure, you're straightforward and dangerous, and handed with a chain. Emily heard voices, auditory hallucinations, they called them. She responded to them. She spoke to them because they were the spirits of her ancestors. But those people around her thought this was a pathology. Now, I have no way of knowing what she actually thought, as her medical records are largely silent of her voice, apart from 1 or 2 comments over her 16-year period of incarceration. She's variously described as having auditory hallucinations, schizophrenia, mental breakdown, severe anxiety, psychosis, and mental collapse. There was one point at which in her stay where she refused to speak to any of the staff, but rather she would sing her replies. I'll never forget the powerful jolt I had when I experienced what I read on the doctor's notes, that she sits and picks at the bars of her birdcage. Despite the sound of that, it sounds horrible, a birdcage, but it's actually much less distressing than it sounds. A birdcage is the vernacular term for a restraining device commonly used in the early part of the 20th century. I was assured by mental health archivists that it was much less gruesome than it sounds. She was placed in the birdcage and answered in song. Of course, at that moment, the title of the book became obvious. A Little Bird Told Me sold reasonably well by Australian book industry standards. It was quickly placed on the high school certificate course in New South Wales and Victoria, and most libraries purchased copies. It was well reviewed, mostly positively, and the reception was very pleasing. The period immediately after publication saw dozens of radio interview invitations, usually with ABC local and national radio programs, and the ABC television made it a focus of Postcards from History, a short documentary. Numerous Aboriginal people contacted me, often with more information on our family, and new connections were made. Some family members rejected the book outright and saw me as outing them and outing myself. That said, I guess they saw my declaring our family to have Aboriginal heritage as an act of betrayal. So in short, I lost family members, but I was rapidly welcomed into a much bigger family of Victorian Koris. This next photo is a photo of 2 of my relatives who I've only recently had this image sent to me by an Aboriginal person who recognised that they were in fact part of the Russell family. In almost every case where an Aboriginal person reached out to me, it was a woman. Later, some men came to include me, but it was first and foremost Aboriginal women who supported me. Aboriginal society, at least in Victoria here, and in my world, has been very heavily matriarchal. Auntie Iris Lovett-Gardner, who held my hand throughout the whole journey, guided me and became my mentor. She played a crucial role in the post-publication period. Her wisdom and kindness became an important touchstone as I negotiated the ugly politics of family racism. She was very amused when one of my relatives asked about the book's royalties, which I have to admit weren't very much at all, but asked nonetheless, they did. Although they were modest, they weren't insubstantial for me, frankly, as an early career researcher. But one family member suggested he should be entitled to half because it was his story too. When I told Auntie Iris this in some distress, she laughed and said she'd never heard anything more Koori in her life. We share everything. Shortly after publication, I ran into the luminous, brilliant and much missed Lisa Belair, the poet and photographer. Lisa and I attended Melbourne University together and we'd often sit and chat. She'd entertain my then 3-year-old son, twirling him around and dancing with him. In her usual fashion, she greeted me with warmth and humour and congratulated me on the book. This was an acknowledgement that meant a great deal to me. And she went on to say that she saw Emily and Gladys's stories as part of the stolen generation. This was visceral. I felt this experience viscerally. I had never considered this to be a stolen generation story. It was not the characterisation that I had considered before, but it was really revealing. Over the next few years, I was able to use this as the lens to understand the intergenerational trauma I had observed, but not comprehended. This is a trauma that for some family continues to the present, a trauma that for the most part, I feel I've been able to leave behind by researching, writing, and acknowledging. I've actually found my truth through the written word. I remain convinced that it is the process of acknowledgement and embracing the story of my history that meant I was able to take control over it. A fundamental difference between my upbringing and that of my children's was a direct result of this book. Where my childhood was shrouded in uncertainty and secrecy, theirs was not. They were always aware of their heritage and their powerful Aboriginal ancestors. Their acceptance in the Aboriginal community is perhaps one of the most satisfying aspects of the entire journey, knowing that denial and loss and uncertainty is certainly in the past. As I was putting the finishing touches to this talk on Sunday, I opened one of my diaries, which was actually from the early 1990s. And this photograph of my grandmother fell out of it. It was a very strange and prescient moment. I clearly had been keeping it as some sort of bookmark. It's a photograph of her from, I think, from the late 1970s. Women are keepers of secrets and storytellers. In all the research that I undertook at the Public Records Office, the State Library, the Mental Health Archives, the Offices of Birth, Deaths and Marriages, it was almost invariably women who attended to me. Meticulous and caring custodians of the records and archives, only too willing to help disentangle the threads of a complicated story, which I initially only knew just the barest of outlines. I felt all the while guided by these women, guided by Emily and Gladys, mentored by Auntie Iris, as I mentioned before, who's a Gunditj Mara elder, and tutored by archivists and librarians. It was this immersion into the archives that led me on later to a project together with the keeper of the Public Records Office in the State Library and the Koori Heritage Trust with Monash colleagues in the Archival Science Department, where we interviewed over 100 Indigenous Australians who lived in Melbourne, about their experiences in accessing family records and their need to annotate, amend and correct these where possible. All of these records were in the public arena, of course. This project, again, was dominated by women, archivists, researchers, scholars and community members. The final report, Trust and Technology it's called, had a profound impact on the way archives and libraries interact with Indigenous community members. The desire to correct records, once seen as a challenge, is now regarded as adding value to them, demonstrating their relevance and contemporary utility. None of this would have been possible without A Little Bird Told Me. A Little Bird Told Me wouldn't have been possible without Gladys or Emily. What I now think of as a sort of arrogance, partly the result of years of higher education and historical training, I thought I could learn all I needed to know by simply immersing myself into the written archive. While Auntie Iris was a guide and mentor who gently chided me that there was still a lot to be learned from talking to people, I was initially reticent. Too much time had passed. Nobody would remember Emily. She died in 1964. And what I had not considered was the universality of their story. As Blair had commented, it was a sort of stolen generation story. And it was countless Aboriginal people, especially elders, who pulled me aside and showed me that that experience of loss, dislocation and dispossession is not a story of an absence, but in fact a quintessential Aboriginal story. One woman simply and succinctly said, "We recognise the story and we recognise you." So in the end, when I lost family members who chose to reject that story, and by extension, I would add reject Gladys and Emily, I also gained family, a family connected of the fragmentation of the colonial experience, forged out of loss, built on commonality. Overwhelmingly, I've been offered generosity. For every harsh critic, every moment of lateral violence, there's been a tenfold offering of kindness, understanding and acceptance. The power of the story has been with me for 3 decades, and it continues to shape how I interact with the world. Family history is a vortex. It can be an endless search for official certificates, births, deaths, baptisms, and marriages. The success of the University of Tasmania's Diploma of Family History is evidence of its appeal. Family trees expand almost forest-like, and branches become choked and difficult to read, causing them to be ever rewritten and reconfigured. Much aided by online resources, genealogical toolkits, and family tree drawing programs, it's a vortex that's easy to disappear into. It's a vortex I want to reject. I've always been determined that my brief foray into family history was to be specific and short-lived. Like many academic historians, I don't think I really valued family history in the beginning. I would look for Emily, I would look for Gladys, I would tell this story, and I would promptly exit. Of course, it's never that simple. Gladys, my grandmother, married Walter, whose family had worked on the ships in the Bass Straits. They fished for lobsters, and in the off-season they gathered mutton birds. Both he and his two brothers married Aboriginal women, and such family connections stress across the Flinders Islands to the Northern Australia. Their grandmother came from Boar Hunt, just near Portsmouth. A little over a year ago, I set out to see Boar Hunt and see where my English ancestors had lived. I pondered the life of a woman who had travelled from southern England to Flinders Island, where she's now buried on Lady Barron Cemetery. On a glorious and yet chilly spring day, I and a family member wandered the grounds of St Nicholas Church and their graveyard. Originally, this had been built as a Saxon church, built of quarried stone from the Isle of Wight. I stopped and collected a flint pebble from the driveway. It rests on my desk as I write. We stood beneath the massive yew tree that is on the National Register. It's at the back of, you'll see it at the back of the church in this image here. The National Register of Heritage Trees. We noticed the ribbons, old and new and very faded, that had been tied to its bough. This is a magnificent tree estimated to date to the 185 AD, meaning it's about 880 years old when the Saxon church was established in the 11th century. Generations of my ancestors would have seen it. The tree has a large hollow in it. The church newsletter notes that local legend has it a family in medieval times sheltered within the hollow trunk throughout an entire winter. An alternative story suggests an incumbent minister allowed a poor widow to shelter there during Victorian times. On leaving, we drove along the romantically named Trampers Lane and located the 17th century home named Russell Place. It occurs to me that here on the other side of the planet, my other ancestors have lived generation to generation in the same place, until one day someone left and in time connected Emily and her ancestors, creating in me a lineage that spans vast oceans. Against my better judgment, I know that this story of my great-great-grandmother from Boar Hunt and her story of travel and relocation is one that I will eventually tell. Not right now, but certainly at some point in the future. The irresistible pull of the vortex of family history. One thing I did discover is this, up in the top corner there, that is actually my great-grandmother. Her name is Ruth Russell. That's a photograph of her. She was born in the 1820s. There are two other photos of her as a very elderly woman, tiny little thing. I can see where I get my cheekbones. She married James Gray Russell. That's the gentleman there with the beard. And the name highlighted in red is the 11th of her 13 children, my great-grandfather, Harry Oliver Russell. As I said, all three of Harry Oliver Russell's sons married Aboriginal women. For me, the doing of history is as important as the writing of it. When I wrote A Little Bird Told Me, I travelled to asylums where Emily was constrained, and I visited the country of ancestors of hers and mine, and I saw the small tin hut she was raised in. It was almost inconceivably still standing, right on the edge of the desert. It had operated as a post office since the 1930s. My father and I retraced our steps a few years back and visited it. It's called a little tiny place called Lillymuir in Western Victoria. Over the intervening decades, it had fallen over and probably one of those strong windstorms the Wimmera is renowned for. But I'm glad when I went there to visit first in the 1990s, I got to imagine what it was like for a little Aboriginal girl and her family who grew up on the edge of the desert, long before she became a mental patient, long before she became a subject of intrigue to me, and before she became a secret to be hidden, and in fact, before she became white. One of the challenges for me as an academic historian writing a family history, or in the case of Little Bird Told Me, a biography and memoir, was the dismissive way that many colleagues engaged with the narrative. It was my experience that many still want to keep capital H history separate from family history, and often even local histories are similarly dismissed. I understand this because I was guilty of it too. I gave an academic paper on my research at a biography symposium, and much to the consternation of the assembled who were studying great men and women. Several thought that Emily and Gladys were entitled to a life story, but not a biography. And I felt the sting of that intrusion into their space, and I decided I would not speak publicly about A Little Bird Told Me going forward, but distance and time and experience, and perhaps even a little bit of confidence, has made me reconsider. Having the opportunity to revisit A Little Bird Told Me has been an unexpected privilege. It's been a rare interlude, and it's not very common that we can do this in academia, reflect on previous work. The modern academy does not lend itself to slow research. The modern academy wants quality outputs and lots of them. You're always being pressured to produce more and move on to the next project. The chance to reflect on prior work hardly ever eventuates. This process has allowed me to recalibrate the impact of the research and think deeply about the crucial role that it plays in the way I do history. We talk a lot about impact in universities, but it's always external impact. Well, this book had a huge internal impact on me. Writing A Little Bird Told Me grounded me. It showed me my connections to the past, and it allowed me the development of new connections and the emergence of new and different types of engagements. And while some family were critical and thought that secrets should stay firmly hidden in the past, I welcomed the chance to set the record right. Every family historian, and indeed every biographer, will know that they will discover something that others want to keep hidden. I went to great lengths to preserve the anonymity of family members, leaving out surnames wherever I could. However, for me, at least in the context of this in particular, while the family secrets were necessary lies, and being an Aboriginal person in Victoria in the 1920s and the early part of the 20th century was often not something that you did want to celebrate because it was dangerous. Where other people have seen it as a betrayal, I see it as an honouring. Biographers make decisions, some big, some more small. They layer interpretation and they create context. As a historian, I know that the stories we tell are always partial and are at best subjective. Although we might try for objectivity, it is at best an illusion, at worst a fraud. I want to see reaction. I look for agency. I want to see responses. I want to find the moments where Indigenous people exerted control, where they spoke back, where their actions had impact, where their voices were heard. When I first commented that it was in the context of feminist history that I started to think about revisiting this, and I thought I didn't really see myself as a feminist historian, a feminist and a historian, but I didn't put the two together. Nor indeed did I consider myself as someone who did women's history. But as I've worked my way through this and thought about it all again, I realise that this is, of course, incorrect. I am a feminist and I do feminist history. As the biographer of Emily and Gladys, and perhaps one day Ruth, I do women's history. As the COVID-19 pandemic continues to affect everything we do, as my beloved State Library remains closed to the public, the chance to rewrite, to rethink, intensifies in me as I remain in isolation, or what they call socially distant. On this day of 218 days in isolation, of course, we are not socially distant at all, but we are physically distant. The plethora of Zoom meetings that I have in any given day, of social media and other mechanisms for interacting, the wonderful Zoom seminars that suddenly now we have an opportunity to talk to each other across great distances, to me is one of the really terrific upshots of this rather ghastly time. So I hope that this reflection on how I did my history 20 years ago, thinking about it from 30 years ago, we might now think about what the little bird did not tell me and how history intervened. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. I'm just so excited to hear this rich and powerful research, and that you will be revisiting it. It's really exciting and quite inspiring. And I don't do this kind of research myself, but I can see how illuminating it is. We don't have any questions that have come up yet, but please feel free to put them up. I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about how you found the journey into those archives of the asylum, and how that affected you, but also what the process of that was, because I find that really interesting.
When I first went to the mental health records, they were actually housed in the basement of one of the institutions in Parkville, not very far from where I am now. And on entering, it was very confronting, because there were lots of people there who had, they were really very unwell, many of them. And I was, immediately, despite the, decades of difference, and I knew that they were being treated much better than she would have, and they certainly would have got much better medications than she had. It really struck me that I was having this kind of Greg Denning-esque, visceral, real, historical interaction. Going into, I was very grateful, because the archivist was incredibly sensitive, because there are some challenging things when you pick up someone's record from many years ago. She had been subjected to a sterilisation. This was something that I had not anticipated, and on the day that I read that particular record, I needed someone to talk to me and sit down and work with me on that. That really framed the work that I started doing with the Aboriginal community in terms of the ways in which they interact with archives. So you'll find most archives now that have Aboriginal records will also have an Aboriginal liaison person who is there to perform that role of being a mediator between the record and the person's experience.
Yeah, such important work. Thank you so much. So we've had some thank yous, and we've got some questions coming through. So Angelique has asked, where did you begin your research, and how much of your Aboriginal history did you know before you started researching?
I did know that we had Aboriginal heritage. My grandmother had told me little tiny bits, but whenever I tried to follow it up, she would invariably say, oh, you don't need to know that, or the past should be left in the past, and this sort of thing. So I was very aware that there was something there. I was also aware that my grandmother felt the sting of her mother's institutionalisation very, very profoundly. So I was never, and to this day, I'm never really been sure which of the two things that really drove her and her desire to keep secrets. It was probably both.
Yeah. Natalie has asked, did any of your research utilise DNA, Ancestry or Family Finder information?
No, I haven't. I have subsequently done a little bit of work on that, but no, it was purely an archival project for me.
Yeah, fascinating. Helen said, thanks, Lynette, for a wonderful presentation. I found your discussion about secrets enlightening. What a great journey and insightful reflections. So another person's asked, why do you think academic history clashes with such stories? Surely the real story of people are just as important as the grand narratives.
Couldn't agree more. Really couldn't agree more. And it is to me, it's really quite fascinating that people do kind of bristle at the idea that maybe it's also because it was about my own family, or maybe if I was doing a biography of somebody else's family, that would be seen as somehow more academic. But I think that there is a real anxiety that people feel about people delving into their own history. I think in the Aboriginal world, and particularly in Aboriginal history, it's absolutely essential to do that. You need to place yourself, because you need to be able to have the kinds of relationships with your historical figures that are as intense as they can be. And I mean, I'll be honest and say it's not just the people that I'm related to that I feel that way about. I mean, I'm quite in love with some of my whaling men. I mean, really, you know, I carry them in my heart at all times.
Yeah, absolutely. Jane Pershing has said, "Thank you so much, Lynette. I've just ordered the book." Can I ask if you've had thoughts on integrating family and academic history, and how can that be done successfully?
Yeah, I think what University of Tasmania has done with their diploma course is really fantastic. I think we could do more with this. I'm very keen, because I work in an Indigenous Studies Centre rather than historical studies, and I think that is a key. We do get all of our students to think about their own, in a sense, their own subject position, their own personal exposure to the material that they might be working with, how they feel, what's their background. Now, it's not a case of they have to stand up and say, I'm a working class girl from the western suburbs or anything like that. That's not the kind of thing I'm talking about. It's much more nuanced and much more rigorous than that, to think about what's the cultural baggage that you carry with you on a daily basis. How can you unpack your white privilege or your any coloured skin colour privilege? Can you in some way use that to inform you so that you can write better history? And I think the answer is yes, we can all do that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think your talk today has actually inspired us to do so. So, thank you for that. Jeff Ginn has said, "Thanks, Lynette. You've made a call for a personally engaged, intimate style of history, the kind that is done by amateur genealogists and TV shows. Who do you think you are, etc. You're right that academic practice tends to be sceptical of this approach, partly because it speaks to individual concerns, not larger historical patterns and questions. Do you think this scepticism ever is likely to be overcome?"
Well, if I have anything to do with it, yes.
Working on it.
I really do. I think we've got a really good chance to show that these little stories are really important. They make up the big stories. You know, these are the threads of the weaving. And I'm just fascinated by this idea I was saying before of Ruth Houghton, who goes from the bottom of England to the bottom of the world.
Yeah.
That's a little story, but it speaks volumes about mobility in the 19th century. And here's a woman who had 13 children. I mean, that's astonishing. And 13 children of whom lived, I mean, who knows how many children she didn't live. But these are little stories, but they're really, really profound and important. And I think we can make that overcome.
The richness is extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Tracy said, "Thank you for giving voice to Emily and Gladys. Where do you think the story goes next? What might the next chapter be?" And it's very exciting.
I think the next chapter is to be written by my sons.
Uh-huh.
I think one of them in particular, who is a writer, I think that's really where the next story will come from. He often refers to her being Emily in particular being a guiding light in his life, and Gladys, who died when he was only 2, but he seems to have a very strong memory of her, or perhaps a reformed memory from all the times we've discussed her. Gladys, or as he called her, grandma, is somebody that is a pivotal part of his life. So I think that's where the next part of the story will come from. We talked about doing some art installation work, sort of maybe doing some sort of, because we've got these rather wonderful photographs, not many of them, but we might be able to do something with those.
Yeah, that would be extraordinary to frame them in that way. That'd be great.
Perhaps putting them back into the landscape.
Yes. Yeah. Natalie has said, I saw an insight program on keeping family secrets. Some of the participants suggested that they wish they had not found out about their family secrets. Do you ever feel that way?
Occasionally. Occasionally. I do sometimes have those, you know, I'll be lying in bed and it'll be raining outside and it'll be lovely and warm and toasty, and you think, what would it have been like in, you know, in 1916 in Sunbury Mental Asylum? You know, I've seen the little horrible wire beds and the nasty looking mattresses. You know, I do worry, and I that's a sort of secret that does bother me a lot. But one of the other things that I guess some of the medical stuff I would prefer not to have known, but much of it I didn't put in the book, and some of it I've not mentioned. You know, there's things that I didn't feel needed to be said. I mean, I don't mind saying them out loud, but I didn't want to write them. So yeah, I would say there are some I prefer I didn't find.
Angie Kaler has asked, thank you, Lynette. I enjoyed this so much and have scribbled a page of notes, points, bits of quotes, and so interesting tying into our current COVID year. Best wishes for you and your community down there in Melbourne.
Thank you very much.
Someone else has typed, I'm appalled at some of the reception of your book, that people could question whether an Aboriginal woman such as your great-grandmother is not worth writing a book about, and that Bolt and Co can attack you. How do you deal with this? It's such a continuation of the belittling of Indigenous Australians and the kind of 21st century practices of colonialism.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I was talking to my partner about this morning, and as I was saying to him that, you know, it never stops hurting. I wish it didn't. I wish I was totally Teflon coated. And I was relaying the day that I discovered Bolt had taken issue with me and said all sorts of horrible things about me, yeah, not being black enough. And I'd gone into a university level meeting, like a kind of one of the ones up in the castle. And one of the deputy vice chancellors said to me, "You're rather quiet today. What's the matter?" And I said, "Oh, Andrew Bolt's just attacked me and I'm feeling really vulnerable." And she slammed her hands on the desk and she stood up and she said, "Stop, everybody. You all need to listen to this and we need to applaud, because this is just a badge of honour." And I hadn't thought of it like that. But now I think, okay, it's a badge of honour. I've got broad shoulders. I'm a big enough girl to carry this. I will deal with this. So yeah, I don't think it ever really stops hurting. It hurts a little bit, but if they pick on me, my grandmother always said, if they're picking on me, they're not picking on someone else.
And if you developed completely Teflon, you probably couldn't write as beautifully as you do about it. So there's that sort of intersection that, yeah, that comes through. So Joanne has asked, such an interesting talk, thank you. Why do you think it is that women are usually the ones who treasure and pass down family narratives? I don't think I realised how true it is for my own family as well until now, she says. Yeah,
I think it's a socialisation. I think men are socialised to be more quiet, more silent, less forthcoming, more reticent. Women are socialised to speak up, speak out and speak back. And certainly the keeping of secrets was, I'm sure all the men in the family were well aware of the secrets as well, but it was absolutely it was a kinship that was entirely of women, for women and by women.
And I'm sure many of that find that, as Joanne said, in our own families as well. It's really notable. So Kathy's asked, hi Lynette, thanks for a great talk. I'm interested in how the process of writing helped you find your truth. Can you talk a bit more about this process? Did it help you to rewrite a narrative of intergenerational trauma? That's a big question. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. It most certainly did. And it enabled me to, in a sense, put all of that in the past and not re-witness the trauma. Whereas I see other family members who are still struggling with it. And because I'm very upfront about my heritage, my identity, I'm totally, I'm extremely proud of what those women did. And I think those are the family members who struggle with it. They probably repeat the intergenerational trauma.
And it's just amazing to hear you talk about how your sons have taken on these this new knowledge and you know that you might be able to do work with them in the future, in the future as well. Deborah's typed, I need to go, but thank you so much for revisiting A Little Bird, which had a profound impact on me many years ago, and for opening up such an important conversation. I really hope it's a conversation we can sustain into the future.
Thank you.
Alan has said, I think the link between personal and family history and academic history is perhaps best made by the comment you told us about from a Koori person, because we recognise you and we recognise the story, because these stories are part of that so-called bigger story.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's
absolutely.
what you've made really powerfully clear today.
And the key thing in that was, for a very long time, I talked about a loss of the history, a loss of language, for example, a loss of identity. And they said, no, that's actually a quintessential Aboriginal story. That is a story. That is the urban Aboriginal experience for many people. And that was just such a profound moment for me, that it just suddenly everything slipped into place.
I feel like we're peppering you with questions now.
No, that's okay.
You're okay. Gary Osmond has asked, how did the process of discovery and researching Little Bird change your sense of identity over time?
Well, it has changed it quite dramatically. When I began, I had this very strong sense that I had Aboriginal heritage, but I didn't feel comfortable with calling myself an Aboriginal person. And I would be very sort of clear when people would say, oh, Aboriginal historian. And I'd say, no, I have Aboriginal heritage, but I am a historian. The slippage between all of that has become much, much more flexible these days. And I'm very comfortable with saying Aboriginal identity or Aboriginal heritage. Either of those things work for me. I'm very comfortable with saying we and our. And in the beginning, I didn't feel comfortable with saying we and our, because I'd had a couple of moments where people had knocked back into me and said, Johnny come lately, and all the things that people do sometimes say. So over the last 30 years, I'm quite comfortable with saying I have Aboriginal heritage. I am an Aboriginal person. They all work for me now.
Frederick has said, thank you so much for this presentation. And he's asked, how do you maintain distance with your subject, or perhaps do you not need to?
I think the simple answer is I don't.
Yeah.
I just don't. I think we all pretend that we aim for objectivity, but the truth is, the sort of history I do, particularly the kind of Indigenous history around agency and Aboriginal people's actions and reactions, I don't want to be objective. I want to actually show that they are doing stuff. So it's not about objectivity for me. So yeah, I'm not really that fussed about distance.
Yeah. I must say, in teaching, I often find it funny when, we have this sort of idea that we're all objective, and it's like, we're not objective. And so we may as well acknowledge that to start with. Rebecca's asked, have you developed ways of exploring the gaps and silences in the archival records?
Yeah, I have. And I've done this for a lot of my projects, and some of it requires imagination. And I'm really conscious that I'm not being imaginary. I'm not making things up. But I do read. So, for example, when I was doing this particular piece of work, I read an enormous number of fiction texts or historical texts that were around the psychiatric industry or the psychiatric processes at the time. A couple of novels that were actually written by, or memoirs written by people who had been in institutions, people who'd been confined in one way or another. So I do that kind of trying to read against the grain all the time. That to me, I mean, when I was doing the whaling book, I kept going back to Moby Dick. So, again, I know it's a piece of fiction. I'm not pretending that what I'm doing is I'm not taking from it anything other than using my imagination. But, I think when Melville describes the wind whipping around his face on the deck of a boat, I can use it. Yeah. Similarly, there was a couple of really profound, for me, very profound moments in one of the Australian memoirs, and she was talking about the food that they were fed, and there's no reason for me not to actually engage with that. And there are silences on that in the archival record, but once you get out into the literary world, you'll find that those silences are being answered.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Madeline Briggs, who's one of our third year students, has said such an interesting idea of the role of women as storytellers. And she's asking about the way women have taken up this role, and asked, is it the connections they have in family life, or is it also that this sort of family history is seen as lesser or unimportant?
I suspect it's possibly both. I really do. I think it's probably both. The idea of women as storytellers is old. That's, you know, that just goes back forever. We you know, everyone has listened to a story sitting on their mother's knee. So that's a major part of what I was doing too, trying to recapture some of the stories that, you know, I know would have been told sitting on mother's knee. I think because it is women's history, then yes, it is seen as less important.
Yeah, I guess these are some of the issues that many of us have to grapple with in our history in the academy all of the time. So that looks like to be the end of our questions, the questions that have come through, which I think have been very thought-provoking. And, you know,
Indeed. Thank you very much, everybody.
yeah, that's really great. Is that one more just come through? Let me just double check. No, that's all. Well, I would just really like to thank you today for your generous time, because this has been such a pleasure. I think, you know, life at the moment is strange and difficult, and it's just so wonderful to come together as a history community and hear someone like you speak. And it's just been such a delight. And I think we've all really learned a lot from your presentation today.
Thank you.
So I'd really like to thank you, and I don't know if we can do a round of applause in this forum, but, you know, a metaphorical one perhaps.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Yeah. So we'll end up there now, everybody, but thank you for your participation, and in particular, Lynette, just thank you for your time. We really had a great hour.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.